Jessica Fraser. I'm a lecturer at the University of Oxford.
Well, I'm Alistair McGrath and I'm the Andreas Idris Professor of Science and Religion.
I am Professor Dermot McCullough and my speciality is the history of the Church.
My name's Catherine. They call me an Associate Professor of Old Testament.
My name is Anthony Reddy. I'm the Director of the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture.
My name is Hindi Naiman. I'm the Royal Online Professor of the Interpretation of Holy Scripture.
I'm Anna Sapir Abulafia, and here in Oxford I hold the chair of the study of the Abrahamic religions.
I study Hinduism, and in my field, what's interesting is if you go back to some of the oldest texts, the Upanishads, there's something like 800 to 300 BCE, and they ask a question which is going to lead to the idea of God. And the question they ask is, what is the source of everything? What is there at the beginning? In the Vedas, one text says, what's the pillar of the cosmos? Another one says, what was there even before the darkness, before creation? Another one says, what is the wood of which the world has been crafted? What is the forest from which it grew? So they're all asking these actually very metaphysical, very philosophical questions about what everything comes from, what it's grounded on, what it's made of. And for them, the answer to this could only be one very unique and special kind of reality. It has to be a divine one, something that transcends space and time, exists of its own nature, and ultimately pervades everything with its power. That's going to be their answer to the idea of creation.
I don't think my field of science and religion really accounts for the creation of the universe. I think we need to begin by saying that. But what I think it does is something really interesting, which is it says, let us bring together two quite different ways of thinking about this, say, a religious narrative of creation and a scientific narrative of the origination of the universe, which of course is quite recent. We've been talking 100 years ago, and we would not be using that language because the universe was thought scientifically always to have been in existence. So if you like, one of the things that science and religion tries to do is to correlate these narratives. How do they relate to each other? Do they contradict, or can they enrich each other in some way? And so for me, one of the most interesting things here is to, in effect, look at the theology of creation, look at the cosmological accounts of the origins of our universe, and ask, do these interact with each other in any way, or is there some way in which kind of way putting them together and letting them interact with each other leads to an enriched or enhanced understanding? So it doesn't really, if I can put it like this, offer an answer. What it does is it tries to get a conversation going between two different answers, but answers that actually, when they talk to each other, can be really interesting.
Well, I'm a historian, so for the creation of the universe, I listen to scientists because that's an aspect of history. I don't account for the creation of the world by the various creation myths of particular religions. They are part of history, and one understands them as particular people's ways of explaining things from their particular situation. And there are two creation myths in the Hebrew scripture, which is also the Old Testament of Christianity. And neither of them tell us how the world was made. They tell us how two different sets of people in ancient Israel grappled with the problem of creation and origin.
My subfield is biblical studies, and in this, what I tend to do is look at biblical texts, but also other texts as well. You could look at various different creation accounts. You could look at Enuma Elish. It seems to be a fairly standard thing to compare Genesis 1 and Enuma Elish. Gilgamesh is a beautiful story. And you can see the relevance of some of the parts of Gilgamesh, like the plant of rejuvenation. The first two creation accounts are often cited, but there are not just two creation accounts in the biblical texts. There are many. So you've got Genesis 1 through to 2:4a, that is, people often say that, so this is the priestly creation account. Then you've got side by side another account of creation right next to it. So Genesis 2:4b through to the end of chapter 3, that's the Garden of Eden stuff. But you've not only got that in the biblical texts, you've also got beautiful things like in Psalm 74, you've got an account of creation where it has God dividing the sea and breaking the heads of the dragons. You've got Leviathan, and you've got these openings of springs and torrents and luminaries and the sun and the earth and summer and winter. So that, I would argue, is another account of creation within the biblical texts. Similarly, in Isaiah 51, you've got another account of creation, and you've got the creature Rahab being overcome really by the Lord or Yahweh, and you've got the accounts of the sea, the waters of the sea, the depths being made, the redeemed to cross over. So that, I would argue, is yet another account of creation. Add to that Ezekiel 28. You've got an account of creation in there, or Proverbs 8, where you've got, it's an interesting, you've got the figure of wisdom being, also creating alongside the deity figure. I spoke about Isaiah, but 40 to 55 has lots of creation language in it. Job, the end of the book of Job is absolutely beautiful, where you've got poetry expressed through lots of rhetorical questions. Where were you when I created this, that, and the other? For me, all of these creation accounts, they go back to something quite serious about identity. Because if you look at the many creation accounts there are within the biblical text, I think it mirrors the many creation accounts that there are, in the world through different cultures. We as humans seem to gravitate towards accounts of beginnings, how things began, and I think it's about being human, facing chaos, and understanding or drawing stories and narratives about our origin in the face of abyss.
I'm a black liberation theologian, which basically means I'm a Christian theologian, but my lens through which I interpret that is black experience. Black experience of people of African descent, particularly diasporan Africans, whose ancestors were enslaved peoples. Whilst black theology, I think, has often tried to rethink and reanalyze the understanding of Christianity more broadly, there are other aspects where it's largely in tune with, and its ideas are consonant with, the existing understanding of Christianity. And one would be that God is the creator and we are creatures of God. So basically, the world came into being through God's creative activity. So black theology kind of largely believes that, alongside the more kind of mainstream / sort of traditional understandings of Christian faith. I think black theology would probably be more faithful to an understanding of that than would be mainstream Christianity. And what I mean by that is that the way in which we've seen the outworking of a kind of capitalistic growth around the exploitation of resources to make profit is something that black theology and African communities across the world, particularly in terms of on the continent of Africa, have never been sold into that notion of exploitation of resources as, let's say, more broadly speaking, Europeans are. Now that's a huge generalisation, which obviously can be nuanced in all kinds of ways. But for the most part, if one looks at the veneration of land and the way in which various communities in the global south see land not just as a commodity that you can use, but as something that almost has a spiritual dimension to it. Actually, most Europeans don't think of land like that. They think of land as things that you acquire, you exploit, you make money out of. And so I think there's a strong element between an understanding of the world and its resources that we didn't create, that God created, that has been given to us as a gift. And therefore, it's incumbent upon us to use that responsibly and not just to exploit it to make money. And I think that's a key teaching that has become much more prominent now than would have been the case, let's say, 30, 40 years ago.
I'm in a very privileged and lucky position to be able to answer this question, because I work on the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh, or however we want to designate this collection. It's the very collection in the history of monotheistic religions and in Judaism and Christianity that tells the creation of the world within the West. And there are other narratives outside of the Western religious traditions. To think about how to give an account of the universe is to think about primordial time, which is about the past, it's about the future, it's about the present. To talk about the very end of the Book of Lamentations, talking about renew the days of old, or days of east, or days of the past, about divine time, kedem, right? So to talk about a constant aspiration to return to the past, to return to the origins of the universe, the possibility of starting over in the Noah story, the threat of destruction and what it would mean to lose humanity. What does it mean to sustain humanity? What does it mean to fulfill a covenant, an agreement with God, to live in accordance with the order of the law, with the order of the universe, with the order of nature? I've thought a lot about and written a lot about creation, and creation as a model for thinking about order. I'll mention one writer, Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish writer living in the first century of the Common Era, before the first century before the Common Era until the middle of the first century of the Common Era. And he wrote about the ways in which we can think about the creation of the world as a paradigm or as an archetype for thinking about the creation of the law. So the law of Moses and the law of nature are isomorphic in moments in his writing. They are the same. That is, if you can understand how to live in accordance with the law, by which he means the origin of the world, and study the creation of the world all the way down through the giving of the Torah and the coming into the land, then you can understand the order of the world. And he spends a lot of time thinking about physics and metaphysics, thinking about the terrestrial and the heavenly. So I think that's a really interesting account of what it is to understand, to give an account of the universe. He's a great figure for us because of the way in which he came to be very central for the Alexandrians, so Clement and Origen, but he also preserves within his own writings this beautiful reflection on how to integrate the Greek philosophical tradition with the ancient Jewish traditions through hermeneutics, through philosophy, through therapy.
Well, I have to say we discussed a great deal in our subfield, almost everything under the sun, but I haven't heard any discussions about the creation of the world. I kind of think more of science and religion when it comes to the creation of the world. But if it does come up, and if somebody, or you are asking me about it, I have no idea how the world was created. Personally, I'm more interested in why the world was created or the world came about. And that takes you to the role of nature. It takes you to the role of human beings. It takes you to the relationship of human beings to all our surroundings. And also, and yes, of course, God comes into this, the higher purpose of all human beings towards a force that is greater than we are, and how one interprets that, and that of course is where religious traditions come into it. How as a human being you make sense of that and organize your life in order to make the best of what we have been given through being alive, through being in this world, and through having responsibility for ourselves, of course, but also for those around us, obviously our families, our spouses, our children, whatever, but also our communities. So I think, I'm going way beyond the creation here, but if you think of it more, how does one's Weltanschauung, worldview, influence how one behaves both in a microsphere, but also the macrosphere? Yeah, then of course the different traditions that are represented in my side of the faculty will have different responses to it. And it's extremely interesting, and that's very much comes to the fore in the graduate seminar which we have, where we have people very deliberately, people speaking from those traditions, Buddhist tradition, Hindu tradition, Islam, Judaism, and also Christianity, and so that we can think together about these kinds of issues.